Okay. Well, hello, everyone tuning in. My name is Allison, and today I'm going to be talking about coral reefs and why they are so important and why I study them for my research. First, to give a little introduction about myself, I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Miami, Rosenstiel School for Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, and I do collaborate a lot with NOAA's Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory, and I'm interested in studying coral resilience to temperature stress. So I do all of my research in Florida, and I wanted to show everyone how expansive Florida's coral reef actually is. It reaches all the way past Key West and goes all the way north of West Palm Beach. And so Florida's reef is actually one of the largest in the world. It's the third largest behind the Great Barrier Reef and behind the reef in Belize. And so there's a lot of coral to protect and study here, and it makes it really exciting to do science here. And not only that, there are a lot of amazing marine life that you can see while scuba diving here in Florida. So I wanted to document some species that I've seen while diving. So we have our Caribbean reef shark here. And then there's also a lot of unique looking fish that you can find on the reef as well, such as this smooth trunkfish that is swimming with some coral behind it. We also have schools of barracuda, lots of barracuda here, and giant tarpon as well. But what's most exciting to me are the diversity of coral species you can find here. And so this is a elkhorn coral, which is actually critically endangered. And so it's one of the most studied coral species here in Florida. We also have pillar coral, which is also very rare nowadays. And so it's really exciting to find it in the wild. This is a great star coral with a grouper hanging out on top of it. And I think this photo does a good job showing how corals provide structure for fish habitat where they can hang out and even feel protected and have sort of a home territory. And that was my dive buddy at the time, showing off how large of a coral colony we found. This was in the Florida Keys, and it's an elkhorn coral. So we were really excited to see this healthy coral thriving in the wild. And lastly, there are a lot of brain coral species here. And so they create these really intricate patterns as they grow. And so looking at corals up close is actually really exciting and unique as well. So I wanted to showcase that they are more than just mounds. They produce lots of complex structures. And so my goal today is just to show you how amazing coral reefs really are and how lucky we are to have them here in Florida. And so first I'll start with an introduction of what coral reefs are and also cover broadly where you can find them throughout the world. And then we'll briefly touch on why they're important and why we should be protecting them. Also, coral reefs are on the decline due to a lot of different stressors. And so I want to touch on different ways in which we're studying how corals are unfortunately facing a lot of stressors right now. I want to also talk about the biology of corals and why they are so unique as animals. And lastly, I want to touch on how we can save coral reefs for future generations. So what is a coral reef? Well, I hinted at it a little bit at the beginning, but essentially corals are providing habitat and structure for all the different marine life that you can find. And so corals are the basis or the building blocks of these ecosystems underwater. And so I relate them to rainforests and even kelp forests that you can also find in the ocean. They're really biodiverse, they're busy ecosystems, and they provide lots of different habitats for almost every kind of species to occupy. And so where can we find coral reefs? Well, here in the US, we have a coral reef in Florida that we know about. And then we also have Flower Garden Banks, which is a deeper coral reef in the Gulf of Mexico. We have the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico have coral reefs, but then we also have in the Pacific a ton of different reefs that are managed by the US. And so we have Hawaii and then the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, Guam, American Samoa. We have a lot of coral reefs that we protect and manage. And so even in the US alone, we have a lot of diversity. So when we're looking at the coral reefs all over the world, these dots here, the red dots are showing the highest density of corals. And so what we can see is a sort of a trend that they're all falling in this horizontal area. And that's because they're hugging the equator, essentially. And the reason for that is that they have very specific needs for optimal survival. So tropical coral reefs need warmer temperatures, which is why they're found around the equator. And they also are typically in these shallow areas like you see here in this image. Also in this image, the water quality is very good. It's very clear. Light is easily passing through, and that is also very important for coral survival. So coral reefs need adequate sunlight. They need low nutrient waters or good water quality, like I mentioned, and warm temperatures. However, they have a specific range of temperatures that they like. Obviously, if we go too hot, no animal is going to enjoy that. And so because of this, they're typically found in shallow areas. So how old are corals? This photo is showing a researcher actually using a hydraulic drill to take a core from the center of the coral. And we can actually age them very similarly to how we do tree rings, where we are just counting the annual growth bands. And what we found is that some corals can live up to 5,000 years old. So they are very old living animals that can produce these growth bands through their skeleton. And so that is just another reason that they are so unique. So why are coral reefs important? Why should we care about them? Coral reefs are some of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. So as I had mentioned, they are the rainforests of the ocean, and they support up to 25% of fish species that you can find in the ocean. So they support a lot of different forms of life, and in the vast expanse of the ocean, coral reefs are kind of like the downtown bustling city center of the ocean. Not only that, they help us in a lot of ways too. So coral reefs are natural seawalls. And what I mean by that is for these coastal communities or islands that have coral reefs right off their shoreline, those coral reefs are absorbing up to 97% of wave energy that is created by the ocean. And so when we look at things like hurricanes or storm surges from very powerful winds, coral reefs are protecting us from even further damage that would happen without them. And so this puts a lot of value on them in keeping us safe and keeping our coastal communities safe as well. And so, unfortunately, like a lot of things right now, coral reefs are also threatened by climate change, and they are dying due to rising ocean temperatures and ocean acidification, which is essentially degrading the coral structures. And so we're seeing, because of these rising ocean temperatures, we're seeing more and more mass bleaching events, where we go from a healthy coral population on the left here to a completely white and bleached landscape. And then on the right, if that bleaching lasts for a long time, if those temperatures don't drop, the corals will eventually die. And it creates this sort of rubble of rock left behind. And those communities are no longer as diverse without the corals there. And so I had mentioned, obviously, climate change and rising temperatures are the main reason for this decline. But we also have other stressors that are impacting coral reefs too. So overfishing is a problem because it's causing sort of shifts in the ecosystem structure, where in a healthy coral reef, we have a balance of organisms that are all interacting. And when we remove some of those key players, we sort of lead to shifts in unwanted biomass, like, for example, algae overgrowth, and they're outcompeting the corals for space. Things like that are sort of cascading effects due to overfishing. We also have pollution, so that could be trash that's finding their way into the ocean, but also runoff from nutrients of agriculture or sewage. Things like that are reducing the water quality, and so that's going to negatively affect the coral reefs as well. And lastly, physical destruction is also a problem. So corals are creating these strong structures, but when humans use these environments, like anchoring for a visit to the reef, they can easily break these structures. And also things like netting getting stuck in the corals themselves can also cause problems. So there are a lot of ways in which we impact them, whether we know what we're doing or not. But what is a coral exactly? I have already hinted at this, or I have already told you the answer, but I like to bring this photo up because this is me diving in Florida, and on the left here is a coral, but it just looks like a boulder, honestly. Like, it doesn't look like anything exciting. But in actuality, they are animals. And so when we look up close, we can see why and see how they interact biologically. So corals are specifically cnidarians. They are related to jellyfish and sea anemones. And the reason for that is they all share this capability of having stinging cells. So jellyfish, we all know jellyfish sting at various degrees. Corals also can sting, and most of them don't affect us, but they have that same capability, which would affect a fish or a smaller organism. So corals are also unique in that they create this skeleton. So when we look at this photo, most of this structure is actually calcium carbonate, and that is the skeleton that they are growing as they build these structures. But being animals, they do have these tissue layers on top of it that they're using to get nutrients and continue to grow. So when we look really closely under the microscope, we can actually see that this coral has a ton of tiny little mouths and tentacles, which together are called a polyp. And those mouths can eat little particles in the water. And then that is what gets digested and helps them continue to grow their skeleton. And so these are photos of baby corals. So these corals are about a few months old, I would say. And they start with basically one mouth and one row of tentacles. And that's what this green halo is showing, is the mouth. And so as corals grow, they physically grow more mouths and more tentacles. So they're essentially cloning themselves as they grow. And so over time, this develops into what we call a colonial organism. So it's one animal, but it's made up of millions of mouths and essentially little replicates of itself. And so when we look at a coral's sort of side view, we can see that this tissue and skeleton are very intricately intertwined. And so it's, but what you can see in this difference in coloration is that the skeleton at the bottom here is mainly white, but at the top we have these brown colors that are sort of intertwined in the tissue. And so that brown coloration actually comes from this type of algae that lives inside of the coral tissues. So not only are the corals animals, but they're hosting a plant or an algae cell that's living inside of them. And so that's what's producing this color, or the vibrant colors of corals that you see. And this makes sense when we go back to what I was talking about with them needing shallow waters and sunlight. It's not because the animal needs sunlight, it's because the plant that they host needs sunlight. And so those algae cells are photosynthesizing during the day. They're producing sugars, and the coral animal is taking those sugars and using them for food. And actually up to 90% of the coral's food is coming from that algae. So that is a really big responsibility that's put on those plant cells. And that's why this relationship is so important for the coral. So there are benefits on both sides. The coral's obviously getting food from this algae, which we call zooxanthellae. It's the type of algae that we find. They're getting products from photosynthesis, but the coral's also helping the algae. The coral is producing different products that the algae can use to grow and multiply and safely survive. And also the coral is providing a habitat for this algae. So the algae can live within the coral and be safely protected. And so when we look at these photos of coral bleaching, and we see this change in coloration from healthy to bleached corals, what's actually happening is the coral is losing the algae. So the coral is becoming so stressed out from these high temperatures that the algae can no longer survive within the coral, and the coral essentially spits it out and it becomes white in color. And so we can see this more visually in this image, where as temperatures continue to rise, the density of those algae are decreasing until the coral is completely bleached and essentially has no food source left. And that's when it's left vulnerable to dying if it can't maintain its balance inside anymore. So what can we do to save coral reefs? There's unfortunately a lot of stressors impacting them right now. And so there are a lot of ways in which we need to either improve our methods of management, as well as study different ways that we can help improve the coral survivorship. And so the environment is a global environment, and so a lot of these large-scale effects are impacting coral reefs. So one of the ways we can help coral reefs is through reducing greenhouse gas emissions and our pollution that we're contributing into the ocean. We can also protect more habitat for the coral reefs and focus on those spaces. And also we need to collaborate and make this possible because it is a global issue. So for coral scientists, there are some strategies that we found to be successful, and one of those is called coral restoration. When I mentioned earlier that corals are colonial organisms, we can actually use that as a tool to help rebuild the coral reefs. So we fragment these corals into small pieces, and because they're able to replicate themselves, we can essentially regrow them at a faster rate. And that's what you're seeing here in these two photos are pieces of corals that got fragmented and are regrowing quickly on either on the reef or in these tree structures. And this is one way that we've found that we can really make a difference in sort of rebuilding the reefs here in Florida and throughout the world. And we're seeing great results, which is really exciting in terms of their growth and survivorship back on the reef. And lastly, there's ways we can use these corals out in the field and bring them into laboratory settings to try to better understand how they tolerate things like heat stress and how we can sort of understand molecularly what they're capable of. And ideally, we can select certain coral species or certain colonies that we can use to improve our reefs so that they will survive for future generations. And so with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Allyson. This was absolutely fantastic. I just learned so much about corals. It was so cool to hear about how they're made up of so many different mouths and tentacles, and that they're not rocks. I have a couple questions for you. The first being, why did you choose to study corals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I really fell in love with corals when I got hands-on experience doing some of the coral restoration work in the Florida Keys. And it was getting to sort of see them under the microscope, see them close up, where I really became passionate about wanting to protect them and wanting to make sure that people who scuba dive or snorkel and visit Florida are able to see these beautiful animals for many years to come. So it was really getting out into the field in the ocean and seeing them that made me want to study corals.
That's awesome. What is the hardest part about being a coral scientist?
I think yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to, I guess, study corals when there's so many things stacked against them. You know, where we're trying really hard to do our best and, you know, conserve the oceans, preserve them as we know them, but it is hard sometimes when there's a lot that you need to make sure that you fix for them to set them up for success. And so we're trying all different ways we can at this point to keep them around.
Yeah, that can be hard. That can be difficult. Um, and then I guess that this is a kind of doom and gloom question, but I always see on the news like Great Barrier Reef has bleached again this year, a big bleaching event. Why is the Great Barrier Reef always bleaching?
Yeah, so it's a fair question. I think the Great Barrier Reef gets a lot of press because it is the largest coral reef ecosystem in the world. And something as large as that being affected by climate change is really a scary thought. So unfortunately, it is due to climate change, and it's due to those increasing ocean temperatures that we're seeing more bleaching events every year. And scientists who study climatology and the ocean temperatures are predicting that we're going to see more mass bleaching events, and they're going to increase in frequency. So we're already seeing that on the Great Barrier Reef, and unfortunately, I think this is going to continue to be a pattern. But what's so staggering is the large scale of the Great Barrier Reef, how they do these aerial surveys by plane to try to quantify, and they can see all of that bleached coral from the plane and basically determine the percentage of corals that are unlikely to survive. So it's unfortunate that it's happening even there, but no country is, removed from this issue of climate change. So we're going to be seeing this everywhere.
Wow. Well, I don't want to end this on a sad note. So give me a coral fun fact. What's a coral fun fact that makes you happy?
One thing I think a lot of people don't know is that corals basically have one time a year in which they reproduce, or at least one time frame per year, and they reproduce following a full moon. And so it's just this crazy phenomenon where they somehow, in their environment, they're all able to communicate and synchronize this event where they're able to create new diversity. And it only happens once or twice a year per species. So it's really, really neat if you look more into it, how they're able to do that.
That's really cool that they all know when to do it. They all know the day, but they don't have any brains. They're
No.
Nigerian. They have no way of talking or thinking about anything. They just somehow know with no brains. And wow, that's crazy. Nature's wild. All right. Well, thank you so much for this talk. I learned so much, and I know everybody else watching this will. Thank you for taking your time. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.